Hello, John here. A student asked me in response to my last video. I always get all these really interesting questions, but this one just was delightful. She said, "Does nature want me to be happy?" I think that's just such a great question. Now, obviously, um, she I don't think she meant it in the sense of nature being a substitute for God or Mother Nature, some kind of power in the sky, but more like, um, is it natural to be happy, right? And that's a great question. I mean, previous eras, maybe like a couple hundred years ago, it was probably much more natural for people to ask the question, does God want me to be happy? And there were plenty of people who said, no, God thinks you suck. Because of the fall, we're all tainted by original sin, and we're supposed to suffer in this life, and that's our fate. And we will have kind of pleasure and paradise after death if we've been good. And you read like those beautiful passages at the end of the book of Revelations, the last book in the Bible, and I saw the new Jerusalem coming down from the sky, and he shall wipe away every tear from their eyes, and there shall be no more suffering. Right? It's very moving. It's very beautiful. But the idea was that for various reasons we can't ever get away from suffering, and that the life here in the city of man was always going to be more or less filled with suffering and disappointment because of the fall, because of the nature of the world, right? So the attitude, I mean, it varied different times, but the basic attitude was that no, you're not supposed to be happy. You're supposed to strive to be good and virtuous and to do God's law and things like that. But now in the modern world, for the most part, after what Nietzsche calls the death of God, the decline of that kind of religious worldview, even among people who think of themselves as very religious. I mean, people who think of themselves as religious in many ways are behaving like secular people regardless. I mean, if their kid gets hit by a car, they don't lay on hands and start praying for them. They take them to a hospital, and they trust modern medicine. They don't actually just pray on it or things like that. But anyhow, so in a more secular world like we live in, just because we get rid of God, or we get rid of various kinds of religious and mythological explanations for certain basic flaws that we see in the world, it doesn't make those questions any less urgent to us. So we still ask those questions, and that's the student saying to me, like, does nature want me to be happy, is a very adorable and obvious manifestation of that. Right? So I will attempt to answer the question on its own terms. I think that basically the answer is no, that nature does not want you to be happy. If you think of happy as being content, satisfied, relaxed, chill, right? If you think of happiness as being in kind of a pleasant state, then no, I don't think nature wants you to be in that state at all, right? Nature is, as Richard Dawkins so memorably put it in his book, The Selfish Gene, there is what's good for the species, and then there's what's good for the organism, right? There's what's good for, let's say, the human race as a species, Homo sapien, and there's what's good for the individual, for you, for me. And those things don't necessarily coincide, right? I mean, I think this is obvious when people think about groups, but very often they get confused when they ramp it up to the group, to the species level. So I think it's obvious to most of us that what's good for your group is not necessarily good for you. So you dying in war, right, to go to defeat the Nazis, right, to go off to war, and then you dying in war, that might be good for your group, defined as, the British or Americans or French or Canadians or the free world or democracy or something like that. Might be good for the group, but it's not good for you as an individual, because now you're dead, right? Or you might get horribly disfigured or lose your legs or something like that in war. So it's not good for you, right? And same thing goes for any kind of group-to-group conflict. And it also goes for the species, right? But it's much deeper than that, right? Because really you have to think about what is the nature of pleasure and pain in their essence, right? Pleasure and pain are basically a messaging system through your body. So if I put my hand over a flame, right, I'm gonna get like a jolt of pain to my brain, and it's basically my brain saying, like, move your hand, dumbass, you're gonna burn your hand. Because clearly having my skin burnt is not good for the organism at all. It's likely to make it harder for me to maybe to hunt or to gather or to do things, to manipulate tools. It's going to open me up to infection. It can do all sorts of things. So that pain is an indication to try and get me to stop doing something that I'm doing that is bad for me as a body, as an animal, right? And likewise, things that feel good, in their most basic sense, they feel good because they're absolutely necessary. So if you are hungry, food tastes really, really good. If you're really thirsty, glass of cold water on a very hot day when you come inside, like, you've never had such a good glass of water, right? So if you're really, and that applies to everything, if you're really horny, right, sex is going to be exceptionally amazing, whatever it is, right? But these are all things, if you don't eat, you will eventually die, right? If you don't drink water or some liquid, you will eventually die. If nobody ever sort of had sex, then eventually, our species would have gone extinct a really long time ago. So these are things that feel good, but they're linked to a higher purpose that is a purpose of the species, right? Now, of course, the pleasure and pain mechanisms can be hijacked in various ways, and we're going to talk about that in future videos. Like, for the most obvious example would be things like drug addiction or various kinds of compulsive behaviors, gambling addiction. Those are situations where these mechanisms can be hijacked. But leaving that aside for the moment, in its most basic sense, these pleasure and pain, they are rewards and punishments that are intended to try and get you to do certain things and refrain from doing other things, right? That's their basic essence, right? So in that sense, in answer to the student's question, right, does nature want you to be happy? No, right? Nature wants you to be striving towards particular goals, right? And you get various hits of dopamine and endorphins, and you get like all sorts of positive brain chemies as you are pursuing certain goals that are good for the individual or the species, right? And that's, once you actually attain them, you don't, right? This is why often the worst thing that can happen to many people is to get what they want, right? Is to attain their goal, right? And there's a reason why this class is called the pursuit of happiness, as opposed to being happy, right? Which is something I could have called it that, because one of the things I hope to convince you of is that it is actually in the pursuit of goals, the pursuit of happiness, that's where we actually find most of our enjoyment in life. It's not in the actual having those things. But we'll talk about that more in the next video. But all right, thank you very much.